My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we are brachiating bravely into the unknown as we explore Mouthbrood.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Mouthbrood is a 36-page system-agnostic module for use with sci-fi, investigative, and horror games. The author and artwork is by Amanda Lee Frank. The editing is by Andre Novoa. Layout and design is by Lena and Nando. The location is an odd forest-like biosphere stuck in the icy mountains of the Kaskawulsh Glacier in Canada, where the characters must venture to collect specimens of unknown origins. Touch nothing and you're probably safe. Start fiddling around and die. Because the monster is definitely something you don't want to deal with. Includes alien fauna, otherworldly plants, devourers of matter and bone, all amidst a hot and humid ecosystem trapped in the frozen north.
And the contents begin with a weirdly atmospheric alien-looking cover, and then after that you get into the intro, which explains what this is, something similar to the précis Jason has just given us, and then some play procedures such as things like how long it takes to move from one hex to another within the dome, which is 1 minute quickly but going to run into something, 5 minutes slowly, and little notes like the fact that progress is slow in here because it's full of trees or tree-like things, but you can always climb up and down pretty easily, even though for humans that might take some effort. That is followed up after that little ground setting page or so with why are you here? And this is where we get the backstory about your dubiously legal expedition. Your characters have signed up to go and get at least 5 living specimens of organisms. So it could be animals, could be fungi, could be anything really. But they have bonuses if they get more. And you're also presented with 4 expedition roles and the skills and equipment that they bring. And the idea is that this is system agnostic, but you'll apply these templates to whatever rule system you're using. That's followed by an in-character field report form for the players to fill in with notes on the organisms they find as they go along. And then we get into what you would consider the main body of an adventure. So you have hex descriptions and random encounters that are divided into 3 levels, starting at the bottom, the undergrowth, so the floor of the dome, everything that's around there. Then the canopy for when you climb up into the trees a bit further. And finally, the top level is referred to as emergent, and that's way up in the tops of the trees, maybe poking your head out into the space between the dome roof and the very tips of the vegetation. That is actually relatively small compared to what takes up the bulk of this adventure, which is the bestiary. The bestiary is 20 pages of weird alien creatures and plant life and other things that are probably neither animal nor plant or something else. And it's all very evocatively illustrated for each of these, usually 1-page entries. But one particular monster that I think we'll talk about gets a double-page spread for both its picture and its descriptions. At the very end, we get a map of the dome, which is 22 hexes in total. That map also includes an exterior view of what the dome looks like embedded in the glacier. There's a diagram of the vegetation levels to help you picture it. And there's also a sort of handout-like illustration included in the margins of the map, which is of an inscription that can be found at a particular location within the dome. And that is it. That's the book. So, bona fides.
I've only read it, but I'm definitely going to run it. Probably in Cthulhu Dark, maybe Trophy Dark. I'm super into it.
Yes, cool. I have run it as a one-shot, and I used the Revolution Comes to the Kingdom rules because it seemed like a good idea, and I would say it was. So, yeah. It was just a 3-hour session.
Indeed. So things we liked. In the interest of full disclosure, Amanda Lee Frank, the creator of Mouthbrood, is one of my collaborators on The Between. She does all the artwork for The Between and has set the visual style of it. And so I just want to throw that out there. Having said that, I was actually unaware of this module until Tom wanted to cover it for the show. So I dived into it really with no expectations at all, except that I knew the art would be amazing. And that's a great place to start. The art is, in fact, amazing. It's very, very beautiful.
Yeah.
Amanda is an extremely talented artist. I mean, very beautiful line work. And she's especially good at rendering weird organic details, which is what this is all about. an incredible amount of detail in Mouth Brood. Each full-page illustration has dozens of little things to sort of find and appreciate in it. Even the single monster illustrations, they have just lots of like little tiny details which are fun to peruse and look over and pick things out. I'll note that the illustration on page 8, it took me a couple times to notice it, but there's like a mouse hiding in it.
Yeah. And if you get to the creature later, that they're basically just mice, it mentions that they would be sometimes found hiding with their heads behind. I think it's the same plant. Yeah, it's great detail. And as a side note, we should mention, I think this is part of the rule of the whole line of modules this is in, but there's only one colour in this that isn't black or white, and that is a kind of, is it cobalt blue? Cyan? I don't know what it is, but it's sort of
like
green.
Turquoise, I would say.
And, yeah, it's good. And you're right, it's the detail, because it took me a while to figure out what the style is, and they are like naturalists' sketches of things from scientific expeditions in, say, the early 20th century, when a new plant is discovered and someone, like a scientist, just literally draws what the leaves are like, except they've still got loads of character in them as well, and like a real kind of feeling of being alive, but they still have that kind of sense of an explorer's journal that's discovered on their shredded corpse, perhaps. So yeah, really good.
Yeah, indeed. I would also throw in that the graphic design and just the overall graphic look is quite good as well. It's very clean and spacey, you know, it's got a very like sciencey sort of like vibe to it, except when it doesn't, which I think is fun. Like that sort of cover page where Amanda drew the Mouth Brood title. That was like a nice break from the sort of spacey sort of like cleanness of the way the layout otherwise is. And yeah, like you said, that terrific use of color. I have been known to have a fondness for a sort of single color statement kind of publication, see Codex, which Amanda Lee Frank also worked on a fair amount back in the day. And it's a great effect. It when used properly, it can be very striking, and this is.
Yeah, it really is. Speaking of layout and stuff, so the map, very useful. That's a classic print out and show it to everyone, because this is the kind of adventure where you know the map going in. You have a rough idea of where things are, and including the levels diagram. Not a lot of people would have thought to do that, but that was perfect, because the one thing you don't necessarily understand when you look at the map is, what are these three sets? Are they on top of each other? Are they, what's going on? And then right there, just as you're thinking that, is the thing telling you what these things, how they relate to each other. And that's really good. And even actually, I mentioned the handout, it's part of the map, but like the inscription. And until you come across that in the text, you probably don't even notice that. You think it's just a bit of like a bit of fun, squiggly stuff to decorate it. And then once you've read, oh, this is where you can find it, you go back and you look at it and you go, oh, right. So it's great because it doesn't tip its hand to the players when they're looking at it. But then when in play, when I said, and you find a description and it looks like this, and I pointed at the thing next to the picture of the dome, and they went, oh, and they all peered around it and started trying to figure out what it might signify.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. That was a question I was going to pose in the question section, and I might still pose it in a slightly different way, but the module has this interesting directions for like how to present the material physically, printing it and presenting it, and maybe we'll get into that later.
Yeah, although I do the question later, but I should say I like having that in there.
Yeah,
literally telling you a procedural thing. Do this, then do this, then do this. Because of course,
this, print this, fold this, do that. Yeah,
you're gonna forget it or ignore it, but then that's on you at that point. Yeah. So it's your own fault.
Absolutely.
But I mean, let's move on to like the play of this thing.
The substance,
I mean, the illustrations are, in this case, I think, more integral to
they
play.
Are part of it, aren't they?
Because,
they really are.
I mentioned, I think, in the previous episode, one of my benchmarks for how good an illustration is do I bother showing it to the players at the table? And in this case, every time you basically have to. You know, that's the thing. You have to. Yeah. It's mandatory fun. Actually, let me quickly, before we go any further, so after this, just stop the podcast, go and buy the module. I can give us a completely non-biased review of this because at halfway through the session-ish, during a break in play, I think somebody went to get a fresh cup of tea. One of the players just turned to me and said, Tom, I need you to know that I'm having an amazingly good time with this. And he has...
It's good. Yeah.
He's definitely never met Amanda Lee Frank, or as far as I know, interacted with her in any way. So that's from the horse's mouth. It's so fun because it's so... I think there's a brilliant mismatch between how well equipped the player characters are in terms of information and things. You know, they come with this equipment like cages to catch animals in, sort of a scanner that they know can help them predict exactly what an organism is doing right now if they've observed it before. They've got a hex map of the dome. They don't know what all those things they can see on the map are, but they've got it, right? And yet, as soon as they step inside, they don't know what's going on. Right?
Right, yeah.
Everything is terrifying and weird. And some things are weird and actually quite nice, like those strange floppy horses that sleep in trees and don't really do anything when you get there. And then there are hideous, savage creatures, which again we'll get to. We're going to keep putting... This is delayed gratification before we get to the bestiary. And that's just great. The simplicity of the decisions as well, right? Go to this next hex, go up one.
Yeah, yeah.
And that simplicity makes it such a fraught decision. Because you've got so few things to decide, it makes each of them much more important. And it just worked incredibly well. 10 out of 10 would play again.
Yeah, I think what I really love about this, just from a read at least, is the setup is very simple, but it's an effective sort of simple, because what you really want to be doing is you want to get the player characters marching into the biome and looking at things and taking specimens right away. And so the quicker you can kind of get them going and doing that, the better. And I like that there's not a lot of preamble here. It's like, here are these 4 sort of basic character types. Here's what their gear is. Here's kind of what their deal is. And now go do the thing. The little 4 character rules are great. I know it's system agnostic, which is probably part of the reason why there's not a lot of mechanical numbers talk in it. But I actually think that it's really terrific from just a sort of fictional positioning standpoint.
Yes. Yeah.
So listeners, in case we've never talked about it before, fictional positioning is this idea in tabletop role-playing games that the things that we speak aloud at the table, or the things that we have written down on our paper that's not numbers, like just the words we write down or say, have power in the story. So if I have a lanyard with an identification badge on it that allows me into a space, I don't have to roll dice every time I want to walk into that space. The badge is fictional positioning. It gives me a lot of power within the story. That's kind of the idea, basically, of fictional positioning. And that's really what these 4, like, basic roles kind of do. And they're, like, the gear and stuff and their skills. Like, it doesn't tell you mechanically what any of it means necessarily, although there's a couple
bits,
that do
not
like,
much,
kind of fun little... There are a few little rules bits, yeah. It's a good blend in any case. But it's mostly just, like, this is what this character does, right? This is what this character does. And so when they get ready to do this thing, let them do it.
Well, I mean, I can tell you what the group dynamic was like in play. So we had the team leader.
Oh, yeah, sure.
He tended to fulfill the role of, well, he's the company man. He's sort of there like, okay, we just need 5 things and then we can leave. But of course, there's a financial bonus. He's sort of acting like the company man in Alien sort of thing. And then the other characters are all scientists of different kinds. And there were 1 or 2 moments where they'd be looking at something mysterious over in the next hex. And the company guy's like, no. There's like some easy mushrooms we could just go down and collect in the place we've already been. And the other 2 players went, no, I don't know. I'd like to check this out just to see what's what.
Right.
And of course, at that point, you're in role-playing Dynamite territory.
Yeah.
So their reactions to things were quite different. And I don't think anyone actually was a microbiologist in real life. It just was, what's in that little box on the page really informed the way they felt about what they were seeing within the dome. It was so cool.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I love that. I also like these little cards that you can print out that are like the sample cards where you write down where you found them, the name, the physical description, observed behavior, and all this other stuff. It's just such a really good touch, and it kind of just really hits home like what this is about.
Yeah. And when we made the ecologist do that, like we assigned 1 person to be in charge of filling out the forms, and he was very assiduous about it. It was good.
It's great. I love that. Yeah. Okay, so let's get to the star here. The star of the show is the bestiary, which is also the bulk of the book. I have to say, these are some of the probably hands down most interesting collection of creatures I've seen in a good long while. They are unsettling. They are alien. But they're also very beautiful in their own way, right? They have this like really beautiful organic quality to them, helped along not just by the illustrations, but by their descriptions as well. It's interesting because this is an adventure about observation and collection, I suppose, and not necessarily combat. And so you would expect the characters to observe the creatures doing interesting things, and the creators really nailed it on that account. Like the creatures' movements, their behaviors, their little tics, their routines. It's very organic. It's very weird. It's detailed. And it's very fascinating. This is not just creatures crawling up a wall and spitting something at you. They unfurl. They click. They move. They have weird behaviors.
They bask
it's great.
And things like that. Yeah, and also they interact, right? Some of the creatures, random things that they could be doing is interacting in various different ways with another entry from the bestiary, which is terrific. So actually in our game, for example, I will say it's quite hard to remember the COD Latin names for the different things.
I was going to ask. That was one of my questions. Like, is that?
But what I will say is they are all different though. They quite cleverly. There are none that are similar to each other. So when you're flipping through to find the entry, it doesn't get mixed up. And it's the one that's sort of like a scary lizardy sort of thing, like a rocky monster that's going to spit some acid or whatever at you. Except what was happening to it when our group found it and sort of saw this thing frozen, like ready to pounce, is they didn't know, but it was being stalked by the Velox sanguinis, the big tiger-like monster that I definitely can remember the name of, and it was about to pounce on this thing. So they thought they were about to be attacked, but in fact it was defending itself from a different, higher up the chain predator. And when that actually pounced, they would just, what do you do at this point? Yeah, it's really cool. You're right. It's like the fun of a nature documentary, except you're in it and you might die.
It gives the feeling of an ecology. Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah. I'll also say that when it comes to like how the behaviors are described, there's a little bit of whimsy here too.
Yeah.
For example, on page 19, one of the creatures, the Cryptostoma dilatatus, its rising and lowering repetitive movement is sort of, the table is created to like indicate that, to show that like it repeats in the table. It's super, super neat.
Yeah. Is that the Milky Cloud thing?
The Milky Cloud thing. Yeah.
That's the weirdest thing in there in some ways, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. The bestiary, definitely the star of this show. Is there anything else we want to say about things we liked? I mean, I could just talk about individual monsters for a while, but I don't think that's
I don't think we should. Although we should explain the big tiger thing, because I think that's the star of the show and the bestiary.
It's sort of the star of the show. The star of the bestiary.
Is it's described as tiger-like, and it kind of is, but it's got a big scary mouth and a slightly human-looking face, which is worrying, with like horrible sharp teeth. But then it has a gigantic, huge, sharp-toothed maw the length of its stomach that it also bites you with, and it's terrifying. And even the illustration is quite upsetting in some ways,
Right.
The way it's fixing you with an evil grin, and it's grinning at you from its massive stomach mouth as well. Just and it's asymmetrical. That chest mouth. It's asymmetrical. Yeah. I think that's what is freaky about it, because Earth animals match each other on size, but this thing, it doesn't. Yeah, it's so weird. It's great.
Well, the thing about the chest mouth on the Vilex sanguinis is that it seems like it's some sort of evolutionary adaptation, because its normal mouth is closed shut because it has this tooth that grows and like pierces the head, so it can't open its. I presume it's because it can't open that mouth, and so it has to have this other mouth.
I hadn't considered that, because I do know that, and this is the other genius thing about the Velox, as I'll call it for short, is that there's sort of a reveal after you've seen your first one and run the hell away. You'll probably find out later there's more than one. There's one adult one in there, and there are several juveniles. I want to say like 3 or 4.
Right, yeah.
And the juveniles, that fang hasn't grown through the skull.
They can open the regular mouth
bite
still.
you. They can bite you with their head mouths, but less. They're less scary than the adult. But yeah, the adult it's that one tooth has gone through its skull. I hadn't considered that might happen to all of them as they get older, but I think you're right. I think it
does. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's like, you have to wonder like, why did the creature evolve in this way? And then second of all, it adapted.
So eventually, this kind of conversation we're having right now, this is part of the joy of this module, is where you sit around discussing why this might all be happening. Because none of this is spelled out. And actually, that is one thing I'd like to mention, is to drag back away from the bestiary. Is I don't want this to sound like it's just over here are some trees and over here's a pond and now we're going to investigate this plant that is different. There are things going on. There are little threads of plot. Like the first hex you go into, you will find the remains of the camp of the previous expedition and some footprints heading off in one direction. You can see a red light flashing above you in the canopy, which you can investigate. And there are a few things. There is obviously sort of looking into what happened to the previous guys, and you can sort of work that out, though it's never totally explained. It's just scattered around in different locations, especially if you go into the lair of the Velox on the far side. And the one that really surprised me was, I think if you'd said, like, were describing this to me and said, okay, it's full of alien things, there's a previous expedition, you can find evidence of them, there's some strange stuff about whoever built the dome, you get a few clues about that. But if you'd said to me, there is a lost Canadian hiker in here who has crawled to safety and is hiding one of the hexes and broke his leg and he needs help, that wasn't on my list of stuff that was in there. And when I read it, I just thought, oh, this is amazing. Yeah. This is so good, because it's so it puts another human into this alien landscape, which is the last thing you expect by the time you've gone through like 2 hexes. So, I mean, that I think is, in some ways, like, I think it's not the flashiest thing in the module, But it might be that might be your entire story, right? Is you've done 5 easy pickups, and then you realise you can hear someone calling out for help. And then you have to decide, well, what do we do? And then when you find him, he's got a broken leg.
It's just the stakes, right?
It's just,
the stakes are totally
brilliant.
Yeah.
And actually, the other big reveal that you get, I think most players won't notice on the way in, is there are footprints leading to the door, but those footprints also lead out. And if they were to look at them carefully, they would realise that the Velox, the big tiger predator, can get in and out of the dome, and it can get onto the glacier. Mm-hmm. And at night time it does.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was our ending. That's how our thing ended, with them basically trying to run away with all their things, being stalked by, I think, all of the Veloxes at this point. Velices? and one of them getting ripped in half by a big belly mouth, just as the helicopter was landing to pick them up, and another one being killed by something else. I think did 2 of them make it out? Yeah, 1 intact, 1 very badly wounded, and 1 just dead. And it was very spectacular because they thought, it's like the classic sci-fi horror movie false ending. Oh, we're out of the dome, everything's fine, but everything was not fine. So that's another nice thing that's in there. It's really good, yeah.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, let's move on to questions we had about the module. We do have a few here, although none of them that super serious, I don't think.
No.
Why would you want to return to that setup stuff? Did you do all that stuff? The cutting and printing and all that?
No, well, I wasn't physically able to do the thing with... So the instructions, what have you, is basically the hex descriptions and the random tables for each of the 3 levels. Because I think they're on 1 page each, basically, aren't they? Or they're pretty close to it. You're meant to sort of set that up like a GM screen in front of you. Now, we play on relatively small tables where I do my Saturday games, so I didn't have the room to do that.
Yeah.
And then it says, just have the bestiary as the book that you refer to and do that. And what I ended up doing is I just opened 2 copies of the PDF in different readers so that I could flick from one to the other. And I will say that I think even with the screen, there is maybe a little bit too much flicking to the bestiary in a way. It felt to me sometimes like it was taking too long. But then again, I don't know. I think once you've done it once or twice, and the players know that whatever's coming out of that bestiary is going to be pretty good, it'll make the wait okay. But the first couple of times, I did feel a bit like, oh God, I'm wasting everyone's time slowly paging through this thing to get to the right thing.
Well, I think you and I are very similar GMs in this way. We're probably very sensitive to timing and spotlight management and all that stuff. That's because we're good GMs. Yeah. But I do think that players maybe don't perceive it as much of a negative thing as you and I do.
I think one of the best rules to bear in mind as a GM is you actually should just chill out a bit because everyone's here.
Well, I'm reminded of when I ran Gardens of Yin, and in Gardens of Yin you have to do all those roll in the moment things. Yeah. And I remember thinking, God, this is horrible. The group is sitting here waiting for me to do this. Do all these rolling, because there was a few times I didn't pre-prepare, like I normally do with those things. But then it was they didn't care.
Yeah, I don't think they do.
They were just excited about what was going to happen.
Exactly. And actually this is because it's because what you're looking for is fixed, and then there's a one random behavior roll. It's actually pretty straightforward. I think it's not as bad as it felt, but yeah, I think it's a thing to note. I don't know there's much you can do to avoid. Maybe do print out the things like Amanda told you to. Maybe she does know best.
Indeed. Yeah. You would imagine that. My other question is not really a question, it's more of just a fun dawning realization for myself, is what does mouth brood refer to? I think the obvious thing is it's referring to the Velox and its children because they have mouths in their body and there's a brood of them. But then there's other monsters that have broods in their mouths. And then there's other monsters that are mouths. And it occurred to me that maybe it refers to one thing, maybe it refers to all these things, maybe it refers to another thing, but it's a great title. It's an evocative title.
I have a suspicion it was chosen maybe 65% to be a cool, weird, evocative sounding title, because I do know what mouth brooding is, and it's this thing where there are certain kinds of fish who they don't swallow, they gobble up their own fertilized eggs and they keep them in their mouth until it's time for them to hatch. Oh, and normally I think they sort of will carry them to a certain safe area to be born. Now, I don't think there's anything in here that does that specifically, but you're right, it does raise this
kind of. There's one monster that does have its eggs in the mouth.
Exactly. So that one's a literal mouth, but I think it's I think it might be alluding to the idea that the dome is a protective structure for these creatures to maybe sometime be unleashed when they're ready. And of course, I mean, just mouths and the idea of brooding both of these things are sort
Yeah.
of a little unsettling if you just picture all the potential connotations in your mind. So yeah, pretty good.
It's a great title. It operates on low levels. It's fun.
Yeah.
All right, what's your question?
I feel like you've got a 2-word answer to this, but I think because there's a very high lethality level to some encounters in this module. You know, for example, if the first thing you were to run into is one of the Velox or one of the particularly deadly things, you could lose a PC straight off, which is firstly excellent, but secondly, actually one of the reasons I chose to use Revolution Comes to the Kingdom for this is it's one of those games a bit like Into the Odd where when you get below 0 hit points, you're then testing to be critically injured and not necessarily dead.
Yeah.
As Chris McDowell has said, a critically injured party member is way more interesting than a dead one in terms of causing dilemmas, right? But I think even that, I was a little worried that if they took too much harm, basically if they got too spooked early on, it would make them quite sensibly turtle up and go very defensive. And then, obviously they didn't even go to every hex in our game. They didn't explore everything. They didn't bother following the little insect's clue that there was an injured hiker. Although, to be fair, that was a weird clue. And I'm worried that, you always have that thing, but they're not seeing all the cool stuff. How would you basically handle it so that they would be suitably cautious, but still kind of want to go and see things?
I would handle it at the system selection level. Well, the reason why I think Cthulhu Dark would be a great fit for this, and possibly Trophy Dark, is because in Cthulhu Dark, you always succeed.
Well, nearly always.
Yeah, there's a couple of caveats there, but basically, as long as no one challenges you on the roll, meaning no one thinks it would be interesting for you to fail, you always succeed. You have degrees of success, and I think degrees of success is actually a really interesting way of doing Mouth Brood, because you do want the characters to be moving through and progressing to see all the cool stuff, but the degrees of success, if you get if you're trying to do a thing and you get like a lower hit, and you just barely manage to do it, or there's like a quite extreme complication as a result of it, I think that just gives you an opportunity to show the creatures, to show what they can do, to put the characters in danger, and then when it's time to do those sort of face-off roles that you can actually fail at, I just think that like Cthulhu Dark offers a lot of opportunity for, as a play group, to control the drama of it and when the truly like nefarious tough stuff happens,
Yeah, and actually, off the top of my head, wouldn't it be good if, for example, fully observing an organism or like capturing it takes you 6 cumulative success levels, so that's
that'd be fun.
That's one too many, basically.
Love that. Yeah.
And then equally, the other reason this is a great selection or trophy is because of the way Ruin works, so that you gradually go up and you're only out of the game when you hit 6. Is that you can make mistakes early on and they won't finish your participation in the game. But later, right at the end, when you do die by going by 1 point, it was your failure earlier on that made that happen.
Yeah.
That was your fault. You did kill yourself in scene 1. You just didn't know it until the end.
That's
and in some ways,
right.
that's exactly what you want from this, isn't it? It's like, I think you'd want to throw in lots of minor things, right, that might be the cause of your downfall. Like, your arm brushes against a plant that sort of spills some red pollen on you, and nothing seems to happen. But then later, that one bit of ruin you picked up from it is the deciding factor.
Right, yeah, exactly. I initially thought it was a good choice because Trophy Dark has Annihilation and those other sort of media references as touchstones, right? So it kind of makes sense for this. But the problem, I think, with Trophy Dark is you'd have to do a fair amount of adaptation to get the hex biome or hex dome thing like into the 5-ring format. That might be a little tricky. But also there's this slight wrinkle where once risk rolls start happening and devil's bargains start happening, I think you're going to get a level of player contribution that is that's undesirable here.
Yeah.
I normally love that in role-playing games, but for this, it feels undesirable. I think you really want to have this be a GM-delivered experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you want Cthulhu Dark and then freestyle it more.
Cthulhu Dark's better.
That's
Cthulhu Dark's better because it's GM-facing. Well, with all that said, let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Tom.
Cyanospora, the algae on the surface of the dome, the inside surface, produces swirling colours that eventually begin to look like an extremely low-resolution video of the viewer's own face. And at first it acts like a mirror, but soon begins producing its own distorted expressions. A smile that stretches 30 feet wide, flashing colours in the eyes, features reassembled like a cubist painting, and later, player characters may observe fragments of their own faces being displayed towards predators elsewhere in the dome.
Of the Harmonia pedophagus, it creeps out of its burrow and lays a wet white egg. It pushes on the egg with its body until it splits, spilling pale round bodies onto the ground. Then 7 larger, more mature young emerge from its mouth and eat their newly hatched siblings. The Harmonia eats several of them too. The remaining young return to their parents' mouth before it crawls back into the dirt.
One unlikely outcome, it didn't happen to our group, but if the wiring inside the box is repaired, the light will speed up. A low rumble of motors will be heard, and the entire biosphere will begin shuddering. If allowed to continue, in 1 hour, the tunnel door will seal, and the biosphere will launch itself into space.
A behavior of Euphemia marginatus, it has been pulled out of the water and abandoned by an unknown predator. The central body is dead, but some of the quarter-sized tentacles are trying to pull it back towards the water.
I've just realised I've spoiled my own chain lightning thing in the earlier segment. Never mind, I'll do it anyway. An injured hiker named Matt Auer is hiding here. After getting lost on a solo climb, he crawled into the dome to keep warm and has slowly made his way to this hex to escape the fully grown Velox sanguinus.
Of said creature, a juvenile is hanging from a tree limb, asleep, its belly teeth open. You can see into the red mouth and throat. Let's go to the next segment. Hi listeners, Jason here. If you're enjoying this podcast, you should support it on Patreon. We here at The Gauntlet love making these shows, but there are a lot of costs associated with making them, and we depend on your Patreon support to cover those costs. A monthly $2 pledge doesn't seem like much, but it goes a long way towards us being able to make these podcasts. And if you pledge $6, you get early access to all the releases coming out of Gauntlet Publishing. At any given time, our Patreon feed has scenarios and playbooks for The Between, new mysteries for Brindlewood Bay, incursions for Trophy Dark and Trophy Gold, and more. $6 patrons also get early access to our big standalone game releases. We have 4 big games coming in 2023. Arkham Herald, Public Access, The Silt vs. RPG, and Moonlight Vale. And you'll get them early and at the best possible price if you make that $6 pledge. Remember, we can't do any of this without you, so head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and pledge today. Thanks. It's the Expert Delve, and today we are talking about a fascinating topic, interior role-playing. Tom, set this one up for us.
Yeah, what is interior role-playing? Is it a 2-word phrase that I made up while doing the notes for this episode? Yes, but it's much more than that.
Yeah.
So, I think actually interior role-playing is something that's in a bit en vogue at the moment, what with the rise in solo journaling games and the like. I think it's the role-playing you do in your own head, right? When everyone else has gone out of the room for a while and you're still in character. I don't know, but it's that sort of thing where where you're inhabiting your character and making decisions for them, thinking about what they do next, all that kind of thing. The reason I'm attaching this to Mouth Brood is because Mouth Brood is part of the reason I've been thinking about this recently. Partly due to as you mentioned, the sort of abbreviated nature of how we introduce the player characters in this scenario. And so a lot of what's informing the play and how everyone's reacting to each other is based on things that haven't been said out loud at the table. And that's actually, I think, the basic thrust of it. So actually, before we begin that, I want to quote something. This is a thing that I read while perusing a quite entertaining flame war on an internet forum about which was the best edition of Traveller. But it's always stuck with me since then. Well, that's the thing. It's like, I don't think they ever did decide which is the best edition of Traveller really definitively. So in that sense, the thread was probably arguably a failure. But someone did post this. And I'm paraphrasing from memory. I don't remember who said it. I'm very sorry. But what this person said is, one of the best things about role-playing games is that when my character does something, you don't know if I've done it because I genuinely think it's tactically the right thing, or if it's what my character would do. And even if I tell you, you'll never know for sure. And I'm not sure that this is. I'm not sure it's necessarily actually one of the best things about role playing. I mean, I think it might be, but
Right.
it's really haunted me, as you can see.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, it's brushing up against something that's quite true. And I'll give the example of how we played Mouth Brew to explain when this sort of works quite well. So in Mouth Brood, because of course it has that Annihilation inspiration. Annihilation, by the way, not just the concept of destroying things, but a novel and a film, which I've not read or seen. But one thing I know about it is the characters are not named. Right,
they're both quite good.
Yeah, I'll get around to them. I promise. But they're called like the scientist and the something else, which is similar to in Roadside Picnic and Stalker, right? They're just referred to as the professor and the author, I think, of the characters. And we kind of did that. So I asked the players to name their characters, but not tell us what their names were until maybe later, if they felt like it. I also did something that I haven't done for several years, which is ask everyone a question and ask them to, write down the answer or just have it in their head, but not say it until a specific thing happened. In this case, the mechanical trigger was in Revolution Comes to the Kingdom, when you refresh hit points, you kind of use your supplies a bit and you take a rest, classic stuff. And I added on top of that, to get your hit points back, you also have to have a conversation and answer one of these questions out loud so that it becomes a real thing in the game. And that worked really well. And I'd like to discuss why, maybe, if we could figure it out, and like how we can stop it from going wrong. Because I feel like, does this not remind you of the dreaded player secrets are bad conversation, right?
It really does. Yeah, it really does. And I think we should get to that at some point, but keeping it with sort of like preliminary thoughts.
Yeah.
I find this fascinating, and I find myself a little torn, if I'm being honest, which is maybe why that quote is haunting.
Yeah, right.
It's currently haunting me, because it's an interesting idea that I'm doing a thing as a player, and I could be doing it because it's the right thing to do tactically or for gameplay purposes, or it's just something that my character would do or whatever, but I don't have to tell you why. And it's interesting in the sense that it does create this unspoken space for improvisation and adaptation. You don't know why I did a thing, and maybe later on in the scenario, something will come up that I'll be able to sort of like retcon my justification for why I did the thing. Yeah. It'll match up with this thing that happens later, even though I didn't anticipate that thing to happen. I'm giving myself space to adapt to something that happens later on. That's one way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. Another way of looking at it, which is probably skirting a little closer to this idea of player secrets and why they're bad, is I don't have to tell you why I did a thing, or I don't tell you why I did a thing, and it's just for my own personal enjoyment and immersion. And maybe that will inspire me to do something different in character that will be intriguing for everyone else. It's interesting play space. The reason why I'm torn is because of how I write games, how I run games, and my general sort of ethos about what is good at the game table. I do think that the way I design games and run games is we should have maximum information at the table. We can step out of character and we can share information with each other out of character, things our characters don't know, and then dive back in character and pretend like we don't know that thing, and it's going to be fine, because it's going to help us get to the best story outcome if we understand everyone's motivations.
Because I have one caveat. See, I read this game called The Between, and
okay, thank you. I know, yeah. So, having said all that, I have threaded this middle ground in my own game design, especially with The Between, but also Brindlewood Bay and Public Access to a certain degree, where there are backstory elements that you are forbidden from talking about in character or out of character that get revealed at dramatic moments. But I think the difference here, Tom, is that this character secret it's managed in the gameplay structure.
Yes, I think this is the key.
That's the difference.
Yeah, it's definitely, or at least some of it is going to come out, right? It's never never going to be exclusionary, because player secret things can often feel like some people are being kept out of the fun. It's excluding
other
right?
people. Yeah.
And or the other thing is, like, maybe it doesn't. If you never find out about a secret that someone at the table has, did it ever really exist in the game in any meaningful sense? So I think secrets, or sort of, I mean, the thing is, like, the characters' names in Mouthbrew, that wasn't a secret. It just, we the players didn't know them yet. So, like, unknown information. But it becomes interesting when it's revealed. That's when it gets good.
What I love about that is that's actually a story enhancer
Yeah.
or a vibes enhancer, because what it's doing in that instance is it really does create this A24 horror movie, cinema verite, dropped in the middle of a surreal experience kind of experience, where it's okay if we don't know a lot about these characters because we just want to experience what they're doing right now.
Yeah,
and we can bring our own meaning to it.
Yeah, it's very
that to me is
austere.
an interesting narrative device. Yeah, that's interesting to me. I'm not sure where that fits into this conversation, except to say it's not the same thing as having secrets.
No, it's that thing, and I think that's why it's quite useful to focus on the idea of interior role-playing. So actually, I think, let's stick with the names for a second, because I think that is a good example of something that isn't a secret as such.
Yeah.
And yet, if I'm playing the team leader, let's say, in Mouthbrood, and I know my character's name, and the scene halfway through where I have had a connection with one of the other team members as by the way, my name's whatever. That's a nice... Actually, I mean, it might be a very sad moment.
It's drama. It's dramatic.
It's drama.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to it, really, but it is good.
Yeah.
And it humanizes the characters in a way that it would be easy for quite austere, exploratory hex crawl like Mouthbrood could get quite mechanical if you... There's a lot going on. It would still be pretty fun, but the characters might be very blank. But by having this sitting beneath them, and I don't know what you think about this, I think it's important to know roughly what the shape of the unknown knowledge is, to know what you don't know.
That's exactly right.
So we know what the questions are. We know they don't know the names.
Right.
We're not going to have a bit where one of them goes, actually, I've been a robot the whole time. That's not one of the options for your secret backstory, right?
Well, that's why I say the betweens secret keeping being managed. That's what I mean by that. That moment where you reveal your name to the other player in your little hypothetical there, that's what the between aims to do in the entire game, right? It's all about key bits of cool dramatic information revealed at the right moment, revealed at moments in which it will be very satisfying in the story. Getting back to this management of secrets idea, I think the difference, which you've highlighted here, but I'm going to put it in the perspective of the between, is there are secrets that you have. There are things that you have not spoken aloud, but it's guided. I know things about my vessel or my American or whatever the playbook I'm playing. I know things about them, and I know really specific things about them because there are these prompts on the sheet of stuff I can't talk about, but I'm thinking about those things. I'm thinking about them between sessions. I'm thinking about what they are, and I'm coming up with a whole backstory. I just can't tell you yet. That, I think, is really quite different than I am just a player with no guidance whatsoever, and I'm just keeping secrets.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's why it was super important to ask those two questions before Mouthbrood, because it was that, I think, was also atmosphere setting, even if we'd never answered any of them, actually. Just thinking about that in the background level. I really like the idea of thinking about the prompts between sessions as well, because, of course, the great thing there is you could keep changing your mind right up about the answers right up
until the moment you have to reveal it.
So that's great. That's real kind of standing in the shower thinking, no, wait, what if it was this?
What if it was this?
So it's good for long-term play. That's pretty good. And presumably, it's not secret info what your prompts are either, so the other players can also be speculating in their heads. I wonder if it's this.
Well, based on your notes here, it seems like you did a little bit of ad hoc structuring of this interior role-playing yourself, with some questions you posed to the group.
Yeah, so my questions were, you've never been here before, but you have a connection to the biosphere. What is it? And then the second question was, what is so broken at home that you're willing to face the danger of the biosphere instead? Now, these are real downer questions, I think, especially the second one. So I think immediately that puts you in arrival.
Were they meant to tell you right then, or were they supposed to sit on it?
No, that was the thing. This
wait?
Was you had to wait and sit on this until later when they wanted to mechanically deal with it. But the fact that everyone knows those are the questions, right? So they know everyone else is thinking about it.
Before I wrote games is how I ran them, right? It's a great technique because it kind of gets the player into that interior space. I've never thought about it in this framing of interior role-playing, but I really like it, Tom. I like your little invention here.
Thanks, man.
Everything we speak at the table, everything we write down on the page, everything that's not numbers has power in the story. It has power in the experience, and it does something in the experience. And this sort of interiority, I guess the
that
word.
Is a word.
It's a similar idea. Just the mere fact that I am being prompted to think about something about the character, even if I never get to say it aloud, does affect how I play. And I suppose that's what that original quote was getting at too.
Yeah, because it's an acting thing, right? The sort of if Stanislavski's an actor prepares, which I can't remember that well. It was a long time ago, but a lot of what it is about is you're given. I think what a lot of people don't know about that is, if I'm remembering the right book, it's the one that's specifically about auditioning for a role. So you've just been given a page or two, and you've got to look at this and quickly figure out how you're going to tackle it. And you start making your own backstory. Why does my character want this and that? And you may be totally wrong about that, but at least you've got something in the back of your head when you're doing it. Having thought about these things will slightly inform how you play a character. It's like if you're a GM doing a character voice and you're thinking about like a certain actor, you're not doing an impression, but you're thinking about them when you're talking, and that will slightly change the cadence of your voice. Similarly, as a player, you can do that with your portrayals. But I do want to highlight a danger. I'm not sure what it is, but I want to talk about a thing that happened in a game I'm playing in recently. Maybe you can role-playing therapy me through this to like figure out what it was. So, problem number one is I'm playing Vampire the Masquerade, but that's we're not here to talk about that.
Say, like, that's where we get off, right? Like that's the answer, but, right?
No, it's really good actually. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But I'm playing a character who is a vampire, hence the name of the game, who hears the voices in his head, basically, of people that he's drained blood from in the past. Some are stronger than others. I mean, personally, I think this is a pretty fun idea for a character. I'm enjoying playing this character. But at first, it was kind of a silent thing. It was only internal, right? I would be playing the game like normal. I'd be sort of imagining what the voices might be saying, and playing the character as if listening to hidden advice. But after a couple of sessions, I'd messaged the GM and said, would you mind being the voices out loud during the session? And he said, sure, that's fine. And he asked me to, if I had any notes on any of the sort of characters I'd already imagined. And I think there are a couple of things that drove me to do this. Part of it is sort of the Sega principle, which, by the way, poor Sega kind of denies making a principle, but he did sort of say it, which is the idea that making a problem and then solving it yourself, that's not fun, or it's often not fun. And in this case, I don't think it was, because I was basically having to, in the middle of another role-playing game, sort of do a one-person 10-second solo journaling game where I had a conversation with someone from my past. Yeah. And creatively, it didn't feel that great. And then secondly, it's not fun for the other players. Okay, sometimes it's interesting to listen to one end of a phone call and try and imagine what's happening at the other end. But most of the time it isn't. And I think that's what it was like for them.
Rarely in role-playing games, though. Yeah.
And of course, what happens is you break that idea of, I'm the only one who hears the voices.
Yeah.
But then they get the fun dramatic irony, right, of, I'm about to go into a basement and the voices are saying, don't go in there. Don't do it. And I do it. Right. And I think that's no worse than, when Lana the gangrel goes off to some biker bar to hang out with some rough types and get some gossip about stuff, my character doesn't know what happened, but it's fine. Is there a sort of a guideline for that kind of thing? Why was that too interior compared to the questions about the dome in Mouthbrood, do you think?
To some degree, if you were going to be playing a character who has voices speaking in their head, you have to have a certain separation from that part of the character, because you have to think about what the voices are saying, and then you have to think about how your character reacts to it. I think what I would have done if I had this character and the GM was not being the voices in my head, I would have really handled it like 2 steps down the road. I would have just portrayed my character in the way they have been affected by this, as opposed to in real time responding to the voices, right?
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I think I could probably pull it off and make it entertaining because I'm a decent role player, but you wouldn't be able to do this too much. It would start to get a little hacky and with the rest of the group. They'd probably start to get a little bored of it, or it would really feel like you were kind of hogging the spotlight, or I don't know. There's just a lot of problems.
This was my other concern with it, was I wasn't sure. Am I introducing if you never introduce the problem, you're kind of sidestepping the drawback to your character. But if you do it too much, you're being a limelight hog, right? So
this is funny because it's interesting. In Trophy Dark, you have to give the players conditions that are essentially role-playing prompts. And a lot of times the role-playing prompts or these conditions are things like the forest starts speaking to you, or, insects start talking to you, or some shit like that, right? And I find that it works well enough in Trophy Dark, and it works pretty well in Trophy Dark because Trophy Dark does have a really predetermined and indeed happening very quickly endpoint, So
I think that's important. Yeah.
So I think that's slightly different than a campaign length game where the character is behaving in this way. I think it's probably a slightly different thing. In that instance, I would, as a GM, would want to be the voices, and indeed I would speak it aloud so everyone at the table can hear it and enjoy it and have fun. I think the answer here is really basic, Tom. It just comes down to the fact that there was a part of the fun that only you were having.
Yeah, exactly right. So
and that's it. It's just exclusionary, yeah. And furthermore, to tweak the secrets idea a little bit, it was fun only you were having, and it foreclosed any opportunity for the group to lean into your to making
Right,
your
they
character have an
can't-
interesting
yeah.
experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it would be like if you have a ninja assassin character in a D&D party,
Mhm.
and occasionally they have to slope off and do missions, and then that's not... Nobody else at the table gets to experience that, and then,
Right.
again, like, they could be taking spotlight time or just wasting everyone's time. Yeah, so I think it's... if you realise you're doing everything by yourself, don't do that. That's the limit, yeah.
Yeah. There really is something to be said about this idea of interior role-playing being a positive thing.
Yeah.
I would even go so far as to say that the whole thesis of Nordic LARP, for example, is this. It's this idea
very
of,
nice.
here's a sheet of paper with things about your character, things they believe, experiences they've had. Talk about this or not. Bring it up in the role-play or don't. Sometimes those sheets have like really specific, at this point, say this or whatever. But for the most part, it's just, here's an understanding of your character and now go live in that character. And I've played LARPs like that where the effect is very much about getting into character. It's much more like an acting exercise, right? It's much more about understanding a character so that when you are doing the role play, when you're playing the game itself, you come across as something that feels more authentic, I suppose.
Yeah.
But at a tabletop role-playing game, I just think you have too many instances of the dice having to intrude on what's going on.
I have a suggestion for how to use this kind of interior role-playing prompts in a more standard D&D type game. I'm going to run this by you.
Practical advice. We love it.
Yeah, we love that. Finally, some practical advice. Everyone's thinking this. But I reckon you could do this quite well on a sort of adventure-by-adventure basis by coming up with something similar to those two questions. What's your connection to this place? Or what does this location remind you of from your past? Something that's tied into what they're going to experience next. And again, say it to everyone at the table. Tell them to have it ready. Maybe mechanically enforce it if you're being coercive like I was in Mouth Brood and say you only get your hit points back when you say it out loud. And maybe don't. I think you could do that quite well. Now, I don't think I would do that for a roistering, we're having pints of beer while playing DCC game. I don't think that's the right place for it. But if you're doing a sort of slightly mournful, I don't know, Nordic or Celtic style fantasy tale where people spend a lot of time looking out across moors, then I think it would be quite suitable.
I would even go so far as to say that in the fantasy game context, the question that you're not supposed to immediately answer is even better because we're just trying to like add some depth to the character so that you can portray them in a way that's a little more interesting.
That's
we don't
true. And they don't
we
all
don't
have
need
to be...
to hear all that stuff. Yeah. While we're killing goblins or whatever.
Yeah.
But,
very true.
Yeah.
All right.
A fascinating conversation, a really fascinating topic. I like when we have conversations like this from time to time where there's no real, we're just feeling it out. We're exploring.
I was just playing some games and I want to talk about them. So
We're exploring here.
All right, cool.
Anything else you want to say?
No, best not. Let's go do the companion adventures.
Sounds good to me. It's the companion adventures. This is one of those rare episodes when I have more than you.
Yeah, you've got a lot. What have you been doing?
I don't know. Just stuff.
All right, okay.
Let's do yours, though. What do you got for film?
Okay, so I'll throw in the obvious cheap things, which are Annihilation book and film, we briefly mentioned before, Roadside Picnic and its adaptation Stalker, both science fiction exploring weird areas. I think Annihilation is more like Mouth Brood than Roadside Picnic, but they're,
I would say Annihilation is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's close, though.
But the film I want to mention is related more to the interior role-playing thing, and weirdly enough, it's the Robert De Niro spy film Ronin from 1998, I want to say.
Okay, yeah.
Strangely, I'm not recommending this for the car chases or for Sean Bean saying the word raspberry jam in an entertaining way, but rather for... there's a scene right at the beginning. By the way, this was written by David Mamet, which explains a lot, where the team of, they're all sort of like burned ex-spies and stuff, the mercenaries getting together to steal a mysterious briefcase. And the scene where they all first meet as a team is full of this interior role-playing, basically. Almost nothing is ever said out loud about the characters. And they're all sussing each other out, having conversations about what the job might be or might not be. And as a behind-the-scenes thing, I happened to learn recently that Stellan Skarsgård, who plays Gregor... you sort of know he was Eastern Bloc, but you don't know anything else about him. He gave himself a huge backstory. He went full White Wolf 90s role player and kind of worked out that Gregor had been in the KGB, where he'd been stationed, that he'd left his wife and kids at some point, just abandoned them, all this kind of thing. And of course, is any of that in the script? No, not whatsoever. But Skarsgård has all that in the back of his head when he's saying, like, when he's having these dialogues. And I think to a greater or lesser degree, all of them are doing that in that scene. So if you just go and watch that, don't try and kind of guess the backstory, that's sort of a fool's errand. But you can sort of see the effect it has in the way that a collection of very good actors, incidentally. I mean, John Reno's in there, De Niro, who else is in it? Natasha McElhone. And yeah, they're all using this technique to inform the performance they're giving. And obviously, we're playing elf games. We're not required to put on these nuanced performances, but, it's still a thing you can do. Have you got anything film-wise, or...?
I do not have anything film-wise. I do have a video game thing, though. Let me go from that textured discussion or explanation of Ronin and offer up Pokemon Snap.
Very much in the same bracket, I would say.
I have never played any other Pokemon game. I have played Pokemon Snap, and I love Pokemon Snap. And for whatever reason, when I was reading Mouthbrood, I was just like, this is like Pokemon Snap, but like OSR. I love it.
Please explain to me how this is like Pokemon Snap.
Yeah, because in Pokemon Snap, you travel through the little biomes, and you just look at the Pokemon and take pictures of them.
Oh, the snapping is taking pictures. Okay, you see, I don't even
know.
Oh,
you've never played it. Yeah. Okay. No, sorry. I thought you played it. So So listeners and Tom, apparently, you travel through these little zones, these little ecologies of Pokemon, and the whole the gameplay goal is to take pictures of the Pokemon and observe them in their natural habitat. There's little goals and rewards and things if you get a certain type of picture or whatever. But I've played the N64 one. I've seen the newer one that's on Switch, but the N64 one is terrific. It's a classic, and I don't know. I just thought of it when I was reading this.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I was reading this module. I do want to talk about a book, which is Hollow. This is the 2021 book by Brian Catling. There are 9 million books called Hollow. This is the one by Brian Catling.
Yes.
And this one is interesting. It's a great recommendation for a couple of reasons. One, if you just strange sort of OSR weirdness, this is almost like the novel version of that, fantasy weirdness. Somebody on Twitter recently asked, are there any novels that's kind of like Patrick Stewart's writing? And I think Hollow is one of them.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, yeah.
Yeah. And I like it. So I don't want to say too much about what it's about because I think it will spoil it. But it's kind of a pseudo real world medieval fantasy, not adventure, but it's a group of characters traveling across the countryside, What I like it as a recommendation for Mouthbrood because it does a really, really terrific job with its unique ecology. It creates its own little ecology that has happened because of some events in the story, and the way it describes creatures and their behavior. It has the same level of alien feel, even though it's more of a medieval fantasy context in this case. They are very interesting, spiritual companions to each other in a sense. I have some music selections as well.
Yeah.
I have made a little crash synthwave playlist for Mouthbrood that takes you from, in terms of vibes, it takes you from the awe of first walking into the dome to trekking through dome to being stalked by the tiger thing with mouth, and then either escaping or the dome firing off into space, which is a thing that can happen in the module. My little playlist.
Yeah. Let's be honest, no player group is ever going to be uncautious enough to actually do it. But
yeah, I know. Yeah. But
sorry,
the playlist is Miami 1984, a track by Willix, Cyanide Sister, a track by Comtrues, Virtue by Psycho, and Cleo Nova by Victims.
Marvelous. All right, let's talk about some RPG things.
I
briefly want to mention Night Witches. You've all heard of Night Witches, but the specific thing I want to mention, because I think it's very liftable for lots of other games in a way that maybe other things in Night Witches are not, and that is the marks system. So that you can obtain marks.
I lifted it for the Between and Brindlewood Bay.
I know you did. Very liftable, as I say. Even the most basic of game designer could... Oh, sorry, hang on.
Exactly, yeah.
When fallout happens to you, for example, as in D&D, you might get knocked on the head by an orc and lose some hit points. In that sort of situation, for example, you might instead take a mark. And that is a list of things that can happen to you, and you mark them off as you go, so you can only take each one once. And some of them, I think, can be sort of positive things, like you stand up for yourself and speak truth to power, or you reveal a secret. Maybe that's sort of a medium one. But the thing is, the list includes very bad things, and as you tick them off, you're going to start to run out of the okay ones and get to the bad ones. And I think in Night Witches, it's fairly typical to get to a final choice between do I tick watch a comrade die or I die, and that might be an easy choice for some people. I don't know. And I think that is sort of related to how we played Mouthbrood in RCTK, and also, I don't know, it feels like kind of similar escalation to Cthulhu Dark for the reasons we were talking about with how you are running out of the good options the longer you spend in the dome.
Yeah.
Anyway, you've got a bunch of stuff in the games list.
Yeah, well, it's all Amanda Lee Frank stuff.
Yeah.
I suspect we're going to cover these at some point on the show, but I do recommend taking a look at Amanda Lee Frank's other games. You Got a Job on the Garbage Barge and Vampire Cruise. Those were the two I was aware of before we started recording this, and they're fabulous for many of the same reasons that Mouthbrood is. Also, Amanda did a fair amount of work, a lot of work actually, in the Codex magazine, which is one of my publications. I will particularly point out the cover of Codex Gold, which was one of her best in the run of covers that she did, and Codex Sunlight, which has some really terrific artwork that she did for this Dungeon World piece called The Star Tree. And it actually has a really Mouthbrood feel, because this module or this Dungeon World thing is like a giant tree biome, right? So you get lots of cool organic-y looking illustrations in there as well. But I think that's all I've got. Anything else?
No, that's it from me. So yeah, there we go.
Well, listeners, that is our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. You can support the show financially by going to patreon.com/gauntlet and making a pledge there. Please join us on Discord. Discord is a great place to find us and all Gauntlet-related things, because, especially in this time of social media upheaval that we're living through. That's all I got. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, as ever, to our expeditious editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listener, for listening. Goodbye.
Take care.